Okay. Cool. So I just want you to close your eyes for a second. Don't be shy. Just feel your feet firmly planted on the ground. Maybe place a hand on your belly, taking a few breaths to help you arrive here. Breathing out any of the rustiness of the morning so that you can focus on being here today. And I just want you to take a moment to reflect on what you want your legacy to be. You could interpret that personally. You could interpret that as your organization. And it's just the start of an inquiry, so I'll give you about a minute to reflect. You can keep your eyes closed if you want. You can open and look at the sunset picture or sunrise picture. And just start to rub your hands together, keeping those eyes closed if they're closed. Bring them up over your eyes. Gently blink your eyes open. Coming back into the room. And it's a pretty personal question, so you might need to dial into some courage if you want to share, but just giving you the opportunity if you felt like it, if anyone wanted to share what kind of came up in that moment of reflection. No pressure.
I'm happy to share. I'd like to leave a better world for my daughter. From a business perspective, I'd like to be able to, for Business Out, to be able to make a difference, and whatever that may be.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. And again, this is not the purpose of the day to have a big conversation about this, but was there anyone else who had anything that they felt like they wanted to share? Did it make you think? First thing in the morning? The reason I started with that is because obviously the purpose of this workshop, haven't forgotten that, and don't worry, you are in the right place, is focused. It's part 2 of our sustainability series focused on measuring your carbon. But the whole point I see of all of this and sustainability is really considering what kind of life we want to lead now and into the future, and orienting towards that. And when it comes to even things like emissions, if you don't know kind of where you're going or what you're trying to do, it makes it a bit trickier to get excited about accounting if you're not an accounting kind of person. So feel free to keep reflecting on that. It's not a quick answer for many people. But what I want to go through is just checking how many of you were at session 1? How many weren't? Probably an easy question. Yeah, so I'll just weave in a couple of things so it's not such a cold start for you. I just wanted to summarize the case for sustainability, which is probably some of the things you're more familiar with, rather than just say a question of what kind of legacy do you want to leave. So we know that we've got evidence and science that global warming is caused by human activity, and we have a narrowing window to act to keep within that 1.5 degree window or 1.5 degree warming of temperature rise. And we also know that we are beyond the ecological limits of our planet, yet not everyone has their basic needs met. And we need to protect the ability for future generations to have their needs met, including John's daughter, your children, your children's children. Regulatory and stakeholder demands are increasing. I added one this morning. It's a ghost. There's lots of stuff happening, and this is all New Zealand focused. And you can see in most of that, it is oriented around carbon and climate change, which is the key focus of today. at the bottom, and it's kind of ironic because it's the National Adaptation Plan, and I joke that the acronym is NAP because we kind of have been napping in the adaptation space. We've been very focused on mitigating and reducing emissions, not so much adapting, but given the change that's upon us, the rapidity of the need to act, adaptation is equally as important as mitigation, which is reducing emissions. And overall sustainability is a real opportunity. We come back to this a bit later. Whatever angle you come at it, there's carrot and stick. You've got access to capital banks are mobilizing around this, and some of the measures they create around releasing and helping you with your business growth are increasingly oriented around sustainability. Staff want to work for places that care and that make a difference. Customers, consumers, tourists, all looking for sustainability. It's an obvious risk reduction aspect, but it can also improve your resilience and your reputation, not just in a painted on a bus type way, but your deep backbone of integrity as a organization. And last but not least, I said stick, obviously regulation as well. But it's a huge opportunity to innovate, to invite yourself to do things differently, and importantly, not go alone in that, because true innovation, I think, comes from really collaborating with others to make a greater kind of leap forward. So anyway, that's meant to be just a quick kind of landing in. Regarding today, we're going to cover what's carbon and climate change, why is it important, measuring emissions. So we're going to do some activities and have a go at measuring some of your emissions. Hopefully you brought a bit of data for us, but I guess you could also get creative and make up some numbers for the sake of the exercise, and some solutions and tools. What you can do in your business, that's not the main focus of the session. As you gathered, 90 minutes is not a long time, so that's quite a lot to cover in the time. There will be a few things we might I've got some things to share if we have time, but if we run out of time, we can possibly look at a future session on those. So, quick question. Some of you who are in the first session, hopefully you guys are definitely going to be able to get this right. New Zealand has a target of net zero carbon emissions by what year? Yeah, 2050. Thank you. That's about a good volume for answering. Otherwise, I'm going to struggle to hear you. Just a quick activity. This one's a little less reflective, but more of a kind of like an alphabet bingo. And it's good that we've got 4 tables. So if we just go in terms of groups, table 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you can see on the screen your letters. Just as a group, like we'll do it really, really fast and furious. So over about a minute. Think of as many words within your letter range as possible to do with carbon and climate change. Just don't overthink it. If something really random comes to mind, like banana, write it down. And then just pick your top 2 to share back around the room. Is that clear? So table 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. Yeah, go for it. You feeling lucky, table 4? You're like, why did we get the end of the alphabet? Oh wait, you are. You're right. They're the ones who got the dud letters. Yeah. Going all right?
Yeah. Oh, we've got 3.
Did you steal banana? You can probably link anything to it if you join the dots. So like 20 more seconds. So in about your last 10 seconds, if you want to be a team and vote and have some democracy, you can, or otherwise you can just pick someone to pick your keywords, like maybe 2 words to share back. So decide on your political regime, whether you're democratic or dictatorial. All right, this is just a quick warm-up. So should we go backwards? Table 4, couple of words.
Trees and zoo.
Nice, thank you. Is that your ones? You kind of said that out loud anyway.
Green technologies.
Yeah.
And energy.
Nice. Should we go then back table?
Methane, mileage, no. Reserve and opportunities.
Nice. And you guys?
Heating, LPG, hothouse, and lag between heating and weather events.
Wow, nice. It's quite cool when I guess this is an example of innovation. When you have a bit of restriction and a time limit, it's amazing what you can come up with. So, hopefully you enjoyed that for a moment. So just want to start off. This is going to be very high level and quick. Can anyone tell me what the greenhouse effect is? What causes climate change? Just at a high level, how does it work?
Carbon dioxide traps in the atmosphere.
Do you mind talking about louder, Pramal? Is that okay?
Yeah, when the carbon dioxide traps it occurs atmosphere, it absorbs more heat from the sun and the energy which Earth reflects as well, and that causes freezing temperature.
Yeah, that's a pretty good explanation. I think in simple terms, it's like the Earth has its winter duvet on at all times. It's got a big blanket around it, of which is what is a result of greenhouse gases. So we emit gases, get the blanket, and that traps heat within it and causes those gases to remain trapped in our atmosphere rather than leaving, and that brews an increase in temperature in a really general, simple sense. So it is like an overheating effect if you just think of that. And what are some of the implications of that? You'll find that I go easy on you today. It's most of what we do is pretty open book. So yeah, so you've got sea level rise. That's happening a bit quicker than we thought in New Zealand. What else? Yeah, absolutely. We're already starting to see those, aren't we? Another one that doesn't always come to mind is changes in the ecological niches of species. So species are no longer, including humans, able to live in certain zones. So half of all the sea creatures have already moved towards the poles on account of climate change. And that's just an impact already. But what we know is that essentially we're poking the bear, we're changing things. It's beyond a rate of change than has ever happened before, which is creating more volatility, unpredictability, which makes it much harder for us to respond. And I guess for businesses, increasingly, we need to be a bit more agile and find ways to deal with that, what is pretty much going to be a continuing baseline of uncertainty, which is not fun, as we know. So that's at a high level, not going to go down a scientific rabbit hole, but that's just giving us enough context. Picture, where do you think this is from? Yeah, it could be, but it's going back to our alphabet game, begins with G. Yeah. This one. No, this is an N. Yeah, Nelson. Oh gosh, that's a. Okay, hold on. I'm not gonna do the clicker thing because that will make you a little bit slide sick. Just come back to here. Okay. Slow down. Hopefully it doesn't do what it did just then. As you can see, and it's interesting because literally since setting up these kind of slides about mid last year for this particular deck, each time I add, it's basically like a time lapse from mid last year, which also paints a bit of a frightening timeline. But we know lots more events. This is Cyclone Gabrielle. That was a Southland picture that got buried in the too many pictures rubble. And this one was relating to an event that destroyed some of the Milford track, which is what that picture that hit itself was. So it's happening everywhere. And I guess linked with that, where do you think this paragraph comes from? You go. Huh? You go. No, sorry, you guys, I've kind of stumped you, but it's actually from a piece of research from here. So I guess the point though is that you're looking at being like, it kind of could be anywhere, right? We know that these patterns and these words and temperatures, you could kind of sub them into sentences and they could represent lots of different places. So without getting you to do another game, I think you've done enough brain warming up so far. I guess this just shows that word puzzle in action, that likely to experience wetter weather, particularly in winter and spring, temperature rises, winter warmer. The thing is though, sometimes there are opportunities related to climate change. It's not all doom and gloom. Trying to remember, I think an article I read was talking about like cherries will thrive more or seasons expand more, and that dynamic of oversupply is better addressed to enable more profitability. So that's an example of things going well on account of this. Other things not so good. Sorry to put you on the spot, but what's your name, lady in red?
Louise.
Oh, you're Louise. Sorry, I haven't met you yet. So Louise said about extreme weather events, which is this is a survey that was done. It's done year on year and includes the top 10 concerns for New Zealanders. Not surprisingly, cost of living has featured the last 3 times as number 1, probably before then. But this is the first year that extreme weather events featured in the top 10, and it's number 8. So that, I think we all know why, but I think it's telling that that's really on the radar now. Quick one, we saw this last time, but we know that children in Aotearoa, if you're putting a human lens on this, those born as 1-year-olds who are born in 2020 will face up to 5 times as many climate-induced disasters as their grandparents. So again, if you're taking the current and future generation lens, it just shows the impacts to and through a child's lens. A couple more contextual elements. So who's heard of the Paris Agreement? So I've kind of done a bit of a local picture, take you through things. This is talking about some agreements around climate change. So the Paris Agreement is based on aligned climate science around the world, where the magic number people have come up with is that we need to stick within 1.5 degrees of warming. Where do you think we are now? Not at 0. Yeah, we're about 1.1. Hence the adaptation argument. It is likely that we're going to exceed that. Hence, we need to adapt. Now, can I get? Oh, some of you have got computers open. Can I get someone to do a quick Google of World Resources Institute difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees? So I just want to ask, so when we talk about degrees of warming and these numbers, they don't sound very big, right? So when we say need to keep within 1.5 degrees, or if we ended up at 2 degrees, do you think that's a big deal? If we change the thermostat in this room, you're probably all going to keep the same clothes on. Has anyone found anything? There's like a diagram that you can find from the World Resources Institute, the difference.
This result says the difference between the impact of 1.5 and 2 degrees is that we will have 1 sea ice free summer every 100 years.
Yeah.
2 degrees, the frequency increase at least.
Yeah, there's a table and I can send it to you afterwards. But things like species loss becomes 3 times as much when you go to 2 degrees. Level of heating, everything is basically amplified in a significant way. So it's not just a small little tweak or concern in temperature. It does have quite a big impact. Have you opened something that you want to? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so pretty massive difference between 1.5 to 2 degrees. So continuing on from that, not sure if I want to, I guess the other thing here, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but there's a movement and an organization that talks about science-based targets. It's actually called that. So has anyone heard of that? It's basically a methodology, and businesses can follow that methodology and get verified through them as well. That aligns your target that you're setting right down to an organization level to that climate science, which is aligned to the 1.5 degree pathway. So instead of you just being like, I'm going to set a target to reduce my emissions by 20% because it's my 20th birthday on Saturday. And I'm saying that in a kind of teasing way, but sometimes targets are set literally based on lucky numbers. It's aligning it to science and that global picture. And that's something that you can tap into. There's multiple businesses who are doing it. I'd say this number of 2,000 businesses would be more those who are actually verified. There'll be a hell of a lot more businesses using it. Again, I don't want to dwell on or kind of overload you with too much information, just to give you a bit of context around carbon and climate. The IPCC report, any takers on that one, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So that's every UN nation has a key climate scientists who all come together and develop consensus science, which is probably a painstaking process. But that's where a lot of this data and these numbers come from. The wiggly line graph, which you may or may not have seen, if you've seen An Inconvenient Truth, it's the Al Gore cherry picker moment, is just showing that, you know, things have changed, they've always changed, but the rate of change is far exceeded what it's an unprecedented amount versus history. And you can see that it's all basically since industrialization, which is when all these greenhouse gases started arriving. And we know that the impacts are significant and they're going to keep getting worse with some aspects where we've gone beyond the point of going backwards again. So we talked about Sustainable Development Goals last time. The top SDG chosen by Oz and New Zealand businesses is climate action. You can also see when we looked at the regulatory piece in that first slide, and that's actually back again here, that you can see a huge driving force in that carbon and climate area is regulation, and that would make sense for why businesses are acting on it. But beyond that, measuring emissions has been around for quite some time, and because it's an established and standard way of practicing, it's based on spreadsheets, dollars, common business practices. It's an easy place to start in an area that can be quite mind-blowing and range from hard-nosed scientific dollars and cents to very kind of fluffy and huggetry, which I respect all of that element of sustainability. I was just saying that for a contrast. One thing to point out, I think it was in the quiz the first time, and again, this can get technical quickly, but just of note, this mandatory climate-related financial disclosures. So it was passed in legislation, actually kicked off the project for the External Reporting Board a couple of years ago, but it applies to all NZX listed companies, and you might hit snooze because you're like, that's definitely not me. But what it requires is that they disclose on the risk of an impact of climate change on their business and their business's resilience, and basically whether they're a sure bet or not for investors and what they're doing about managing that risk and also harnessing the opportunity. As part of that, and when it comes to the measuring carbon piece, which is relevant to you, businesses are required to measure scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which I'll explain in a second, which means those in their supply chain will be required to provide data for them to meet their regulatory obligation. So if you thought, or even if you're aware of this and you thought, oh, that's just for the big end of town, it's very far from my backyard, there is a hook in there that will cascade throughout the supply chain. And if, again, you're still like, still not me, if you do have desire, you know, to grow your business, or if you end up having a link and wanting to supply into some of those bigger businesses, you'll end up having to do that sooner rather than later. Anyway, speaking of dollars and cents, so we've got lots of angles. We've got global picture and regulations. We've got New Zealand regulations. We've got kind of increased extreme weather events and the trauma that's associated with that. We've got doing it for the kids. We haven't covered consumer angle so much here, but there's definitely, whether it's consumers, tourists, rising expectations in that space. This is from the Turning Point, which is a Deloitte report published this year. And it's basically saying, if we take decisive climate action, we can add 64 billion to New Zealand's economy by 2050. If we drag the chain, and if we do, or if we do inadequate action, it will cost us 4.4 billion by 2050. But those losses get exponentially worse beyond that and get up to about 48 billion. So relatively simple equation. It does make economic sense to do this. And the quicker you start, the easier it becomes. So I guess, yeah, sure. I will happily share that. So it's going to get you guys to ask, but as I said, this was open book, so I better remain true to that. So does anyone want to share possible sources of emissions? So starting to get into the practical side of things. What do you think some emission sources are? Maybe even you could reference your own business or in this room. Yeah. Why is that? Because does everyone else, sorry, you go.
Decomposing waste creates greenhouse gases.
Yeah. Does that come as a surprise to some people? It's not, waste isn't always considered in the carbon or climate change bucket. Is anyone happy to say they didn't know that?
I've only found out about that recently.
Yeah.
We've always composted, but not necessarily understanding the true ramifications of green waste goes into landfill.
Yeah.
That's only something that I've recently become aware of.
Just trying to be I guess less wasteful and garden friendly and more kind of with that angle. Yeah, it definitely, I think it was a while ago, I learned more about carbon and climate, and that angle often comes later as an add-on. So thank you for raising that first off the bat. Can we have a couple of other examples? Sources of greenhouse gases. Yeah, vehicle emissions, that's definitely an obvious one. Anything else? What's a predominant one in New Zealand?
When you talk about recycling, even recycling, yes. We don't have recycling plants, not many in New Zealand, so we have to transfer those products to either somewhere overseas. That's basically the whole process of.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Mel. So yeah, there's specifically from an activity, but then there's I guess, taking vehicle emissions, the transport emissions associated with moving things around, whether it's recycled goods or goods for recycling, or whether it's taking freight overseas, anything else like that. What is New Zealand known for? Yeah. And so that's also a source of what kind of emissions? Methane. No, I don't have it on a slide. I might get, you guys never thought you'd be Googling in this session, but you can if you'd like. No, I'll explain it in a second. The short way of describing us at the moment is that not all greenhouse gases are created equal. So methane has a higher contribution to global warming. We call it global warming potential than carbon. So it's not just, I know farmers often get given a bad rap in New Zealand. From a carbon climate perspective, the methane aspect is because it contributes to global warming to a greater degree than other gases, which is why it becomes an area to focus on, especially if you're trying to look at the whole picture and where you can kind of optimize. But obviously we need to protect interests of business, our image as a country. There's all those other factors as well that come into it. Just a couple of stats on tourism, and I don't want to do heaps on this, but I guess just to, given that's a key focus and where you guys are coming from, everyone knows this, right? Tourism is, we just talked about farming, but tourism is a key part of New Zealand's economy, generates significant revenue, and very much trades off that clean green image as well. Now I know tourism is vast and broad, and there's many different types of businesses within that. I guess just to zoom in on a couple of stats related to hotels, which definitely by no means represent all of tourism, but just as an example, to meet and align with some of these global targets, and these are kind of more broad and global stats, so take from them what you will. But the first example says that, like the hotel industry needs to reduce carbon emissions by 66% per room. Obviously, that will depend on what kind of operation you have, especially for older ones with older assets and buildings. Energy consumption is a reasonable part of operating costs, 3 to 6%, and it's responsible for about 60% of its carbon emissions, which in this instance, you've got some global currency, but was about £1,000 a room over a year. I hope you weren't thinking per night. That would have been very expensive nightly rate. And broader than that, though, tourism's global carbon footprint was 4 times higher than previously thought, and is about 8% of global emissions. Be good. I can look into further New Zealand stats, and I'm happy to distribute them. But the point is, it's significant. Your role is important, and particularly even if you're one business or you think you're a particularly small business, if we all do something, we have a much better ability to achieve an outcome. So we pretty much cover this, but we know, just to summarize the case for this, whether it's extreme weather events, the increasing regulations in this space, rising energy costs, access to supply chains locally and internationally, consumers, tourists, community expect this, access to capital from banks increasingly depends on this, but there's also upside and opportunities from having a sustainable business in a bank size. They're seeing you as more resilient too. Remembering that, just another related link, when we talk about that climate disclosure regime, banks come into that. So they're having to explain to their investors how they're resilient. So if their books are all filled with, coal guzzling businesses who are like completely unsustainable, then this is a extrapolation and a generalization, but then their climate disclosures are going to say that they've got a high risk and that their business is trading off a lot, they're carrying a lot of risk basically. So hopefully you get the connection I'm trying to make.
Do you think in the future banks will make it a requirement for lending to have, a green lens over everything?
I think there's potential for it. And they're already doing that. It really comes down to them all moving together. Like, that's where the disclosure regime creates a level playing field. Previously, and hopefully this isn't a sensitive spot for anyone, because I know lots of Kiwis have coastal properties, but previously if a bank were to adjust its risk profile on, say, coastal property based on sea level rise projections, then everyone's just going to change banks, right? Because you're just going to go to a bank that doesn't consider that. So you really have to have all of them moving to make sure that it's fair. And so I think in the same spirit, if they all move, but I wouldn't be surprised if that does happen over time, given it's already starting to. And as I said, the measuring carbon is the most dollar aligned metric, like carbon follows the dollar. It's tangible, it's known and quantifiable. There's standards that exist, there's verification bodies that exist. It's a lot more of a sure bet than, asking businesses to share their community impact or something like that, which is a bit harder for a bank to kind of quantify, put a line through, etc., if that makes sense. So moving into you'll probably be pleased that we're getting into the what we can do about it piece, but hopefully that's helpful to give you the broad frame for this, and that there are many reasons and angles to act. Hopefully, did anyone learn something from that piece? Cool. So steps to act, and the reason we're circling the first two is because that's really the focus of today. Kind of linked with the legacy thing, to move forward or create any outcomes in life, it's always good to know where your stance is or what you're aiming for. So setting some kind of commitment is a really good starting point. And then you can't manage what you don't measure, classic saying. So obviously starting with measurement is a key way to actually be taking action as well. And then I can share a couple of the other aspects around reducing and offsetting. But ultimately, same with the legacy beginning, the whole point of all of this is to deliver impact, is to leave things better than we found them, and to make our existence actually count for something, whether we're an individual or a business. So moving to commit, this is just kind of whipping through a few high levels. This is, if you Google the carbon continuum, you won't come up with anything that's just a Laurenism. It's just talking about the range of some commitments that people are making. You're increasingly seeing businesses sort of make a commitment to be carbon zero. That means they've measured their emissions. Usually there's an expectation that you're at least trying to reduce them as well. And then any emissions that you can't remove from your balance sheet, essentially you offset the rest. And that enables you to claim carbon zero. Net zero by 2030, that's no new emissions from that point. Climate positive is basically or does anyone, you want to chip in on that one? No, do you want to have a go?
Would it be in the tourism context? I guess it's regenerative tourism. So rather than taking, we're giving back and improving.
Yeah, I think definitely in a broader sense, and like a specific sense relating to this, it's literally just basically over offsetting. So you're offsetting more than you use and you're kind of paying the offsets forward. So that's that specific term. But if you take a broader term of like actually leaving it's like the term net positive, I'd say, yeah, regenerative tourism would be net positive. So it's saying this is all carbon-y stuff, but ultimately the whole point of this is that we're all around creating a positive impact. So that's probably where the regenerative tourism would sit. So just a couple of examples, and I know some of them are bigger organisations. Christchurch International Airport, climate positive. They actually have, I think it's called Ko-Fi Farm. They have a giant farm of land they own that they've like solarized. They've covered in solar panels. That's how they're achieving that. They know that can be contentious given it's an airport, but they are, going, well, this is who we are, but this is actually what we can do to make a difference. XL Digital, the smaller business, carbon zero certified. Why do you think I've put this one down in the context of carbon? So New Zealand business, they've focused on, set a commitment around being 96% New Zealand made.
So we must be doing a little processing in New Zealand and nothing's going offshore, so it's all staying.
Yeah, so they're
Miles being doing
A to B, yeah, the transport side, exactly. So that's why that one, and Fonterra across all the elements of the operations from sites to farming have got targets across the board. This is Business South. So Business South became Toitū Carbon Zero certified this year. And also putting you on the spot here, John, we might come up more later with offsets, but I believe purchased some local offsets to achieve that. You can
put me on the spot. And I've just only recently stepped into the role, but we only purchased a very small amount.
Yeah.
Maybe even one or two minutes.
Okay.
So
yeah,
it is for being on the spot.
No, that's all right. A smaller organization, but there's a whole I kind of opened a can of worms there, but when it comes to offsetting, there's a local versus global argument there. There's lots of different ways to purchase credits. There's a cost element. Well, key consideration around cost. International credits are much cheaper. But also if you're trading and you're wanting a strong brand, often getting something kind of local and that's supporting somewhere down the road as opposed to, and say India or something, may work better for your brand. It's not to say that we shouldn't be supporting projects overseas. So a couple of things on target setting is I thought it gives you something to aim for. The key thing you need is a base year to measure. So you need to, if you're starting to measure this year, that would be your base year. But when you're setting a target, that's against your base year. So if you want to be carbon zero or net zero by 2030, that's versus a, say, F23 baseline. And then there's a couple of types of targets. There are others as well, but many people often say, well, I want to grow my business and I literally just employed 20 more people this year. Does that mean that that's going to suck for my carbon accounting and my ability to reduce my emissions? And that's where people like that will choose to have an intensity based target. So you're grounding your carbon against the number of staff or number of products produced or something tangible and specific in your business that shows that you're becoming more efficient in a carbon sense. But again, as I said, haven't got heaps of time together, so can't go down too many rabbit holes. Measure. We have arrived at a key aspect of today. So as I said, carbon accounting's been developing for a long time. The standards that inform this, the predominant one is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It's been around since 2001, so that's a long time for this to have been established, substantiated, checked, improved, tested, many different industries, etc. Hence why it's often a good starting point for businesses to move in this space, and hence why businesses like banks kind of like these kind of metrics because they're kind of well established. One thing you need to do to kind of frame the work, it's basically sets parameters around how you do your accounting, is establish whether your business runs from financial control or operational control. So basically, do you own your business assets or do you lease them? So a very simple example of that would be, do you own your cars and your cars fleet, or do you lease them? And that just changes where they sit in, I guess, the buckets of emissions, if that makes sense. So that's usually a starting point. And then finally, you get the answer to what I was going on about with that scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions reference. So has anyone heard of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? Heard that lingo? No. So this is a little fuzzy, but I chose more of a bullseye diagram for you guys on your tables. So hopefully, well, you can tell me which one makes more sense, because then I can decide which one to share in future. So you can see in the middle, and sorry, let me just go back for a second, up the top. So as I said, not all greenhouse gases are created equal. There's multiple types of greenhouse gases. As you can see up the top, there's the carbon on the left, methane, nitrogen dioxide. So HFCs are hydrofluorocarbons, and HFCs, and I think it's called CHFCs, they're all your refrigerants. So if you've got any aircon or anything like that, or you use refrigerants in some capacity, that's those. And again, need to Google this, but they have I think like in the tens of thousands more impact than carbon in terms of their global warming potential. So they're the nasty ones that even if you did everything perfectly, if you had a leak in your air conditioning unit one year and released some gas, your outcome would be quite dire, and it would be you'd feel pretty stink about it if you put a lot of effort into things, because that could be the thing that gets you caught out, all the way through to sulfur dioxide. So as I said, and the way carbon accounting works is everything is normalized into a CO2 equivalent. So the CO2 is like the common metric used in carbon accounting. But as I said, there's multiple ones of those gases, and because they have different amounts of contribution to global warming, that all comes out in the wash of how the accounting frameworks work, if that makes sense. So scope 1, can someone tell me, well, either using your little fact sheet or possibly the bottom of the slide or reading the slide, what are scope 1 emissions? Like the short answer. Oh, I just mean they're direct emissions. So the key distinction initially is direct versus indirect. So scope 1 are direct, 2 and 3 are indirect. And I'm going to talk you through these again so that you're still feeling clear and with it. But this is the reason, or one of the reasons, why you need to decide whether you own or lease assets, because you can see in the direct emissions, you've got things like company vehicles or company facilities. So if you don't own your vehicles, where do you think they go? So they're no longer going to be in the direct emission space. Where would they be, do you think, just looking at your diagram? Yeah, so that's a key distinction, and just, I guess, something to bear in mind. So scope 1 is direct. Other scope 1 ones, let me see, do I have them on my slide? It's quite small, but these all come under scope 1 as well. So fuels, obviously for company vehicles and things, natural gases, land use, as I said, refrigerants. So I can even say, I think one of our organisations, so Business New Zealand Network's made up of 5 different regional organisations. One of them is in Auckland, and I know when the Auckland office had their audit, the auditor comes and does a recce and looks around just to see that what you've put together makes sense in the context of your operations. Like, they can see whether you've got anything else that's clearly part of your business that isn't featured in your footprint. And they'll have walked past the kitchen, they're like, what's that out there? And we're like, oh, those are the aircon units. And they're like, I haven't seen them in your inventory. And we're like, so that's often one that people sometimes forget. Anyway, that would be scope 1. And those are a couple of other examples. So moving to scope 2, pretty easy, right? If you hit this layer, it's kind of only one option, right? Who's gonna share the scope 2? What's scope 2? Yep, thank you. So scope 2 is your purchase electricity. That's basically what you purchase. Yeah, this is quite fuzzy on screen, sorry guys. In scope 3 though, you'll have transport T&D losses from electricity. So you need to capture that in scope 3 as well. And then scope 3 are everything else, which is pretty much the easiest way of describing them is your supply chain or your value chain. So they're basically all the kind of inputs and outputs of your business that sit outside of those other 2 layers. Scope 1 and 2 are when it comes to if you had to go through some kind of audit or certification process, which you don't have to, but usually if you've set some kind of commitment and or if you're wanting to offset your emissions, to have integrity and avoid greenwashing. And if you're, depending on your organization and how concerned you are about people challenging you, if you're going to do some kind of certification process, obviously this matters a little bit more, but you need to have scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then the other 3 are business, travel, freight, and waste. So, and they sit in scope 3. But essentially, you can see there's lots of other things in scope 3 that maybe aren't required, but increasingly bigger businesses, and especially these ones under that regulatory regime, are being asked to assess their scope 3 area. And those who've been kind of looking at scope 1 and 2 for a while and wanting to figure out what they can do next and better are looking at their supply chain. So I don't know if that's hit you, or if you're concerned around it. Is there anyone in this room who's had like a questionnaire from someone they supply to, or a requirement or request around providing some information on what you're doing in sustainability? No?
Not yet. It's surprising we haven't done,
Okay.
especially with some of the international things we might deal with.
Yeah.
So currently we get a lot of things about the health and safety. But not emissions, nothing which,
Okay.
but I believe it's.
Yeah, it's definitely on its way. So it's not me using that as a reason to get you to do this. There's plenty of examples around the place.
Ask a quick question
Yeah.
about scope 2. You have electricity there. Recently, we did something with ECA and the Regional Energy Transition Accelerator. So that was all process heaters. Big, or companies that are using significant amounts of heat to do whatever. So it could be
Yeah.
laundry, it could be a coffee roaster.
Yeah.
Would you put some gas used for process heating? Say like a boiler to heat a large.
Yeah,
boiler,
that's
would
a good
that be
question.
stream too?
Thank you for asking that, because I don't know how, when I pasted this in, I actually added this box in last night and it had heat first, but there was a whole heap of weird stuff that got pasted and I deleted it. So I think I've possibly deleted it, which is why it's a good question. Yeah, the process heat sits in scope 1, because it's when it talks about company facilities, it's like what's used directly in your manufacturing.
So like in the tourism sector, if you have a large accommodation.
Yeah.
Or a hotel, and they use or let's say the museum, the heating for the museum, I don't know if the boiler would be, or what the heating source would be. But that would then be under scope 1.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I actually, does anyone have, or operate a hotel here or work closely with hotels?
We have some accommodation.
Okay. No, because there's quite an extensive article on like that on the hotel industry and what they did to kind of look at reducing their emissions and energy efficiency. Cool. So let's do some activities. Your time to shine again. So the first one, and you can see you've got a few handouts. I think you've distributed the bullseyes. And then the other stapled documents, just make sure you've got one each. So on the first page, you can see there's a sheet that says sources of emissions. So if you want, it depends how matey you've become with your table. If you want to have a go at just each doing it for your own business, you can do that. Or if you want to pick a couple of businesses from your or organizations from your table and look at just trying to nut out what those two organizations emission sources are, you can. You might not get all of them, but you can look at some. And if you're kind of if you want to draw on some inputs to help, actually let's not draw on inputs yet. Let's just let you focus and brainstorm what you think some sources of emissions are. Up to you whether you want to write scope 1, 2, or 3. You could just literally write, we have cows. Obviously I don't think that's going to apply to anyone in the room, or we have cars. But yeah, I guess practice it as you will. We'll just take a few minutes to do this together or separate. Is everyone clear on the question on the sewage one now? But I think it's a very good question. Okay, so are we good with that one? I want to move forward so we can actually try and do a couple of examples. Did everyone manage to have some free-flowing thoughts around that? Hopefully you heard me. This table definitely did, but I decided not to throw you a rope initially because I just wanted to let you freestyle, but there is that resource on your tables, the heaps of lines one. Yeah. So that's from the carbon neutral government program, but it lists out a lot of different emission sources. So you can always have a look at that to consider what some others might be. And this is, I put it out of my email, so I don't know if it's the final one, but this was actually the emission sources of Business South as part of their process. Whoa, don't want to trip. So you can see, because they own their vehicles, it's in category 1, got electricity, mileage allowance falls into that. And then you can see, so when this terminology around category 1, 2, and 3, I'll probably send you a table on it to make it clearer. Easy language is kind of scope 1, 2, 3, but there is category 1 through 6, where 1 and 1, 2 and 2 are the same. And then 3 through 6 are the same bucket, but 3, 4, 5, 6 are kind of split out a bit. So don't worry about that, but essentially category 3 to 6, these all fit within them. Now, what's your name? Sorry. Greg, pointing fingers. I think Greg said something about how staff get to work. So employee commuting, working from home, these actually sit in scope 3. If you recall what I said I required, they were not in the list, which you'll be pleased to know, but some businesses are starting to look at those if they've done all. So basically it's sort of a sequential approach. Start off with scope 1, 2, and those compulsory scope 3s of freight, travel, waste. And then once you've got those sorted and maybe had a look at, not maybe, had a look at reducing them, then consider some of those other elements that you have some to varying degrees of influence over. That's a whole nother, how long is a piece of string? But there are businesses who are bringing those things into consideration. When it comes to working from home, there's like a standardized emissions factor you can use. So don't feel like you have to do an assessment on everyone's house and trailer they live in and whatever other scenario. It's just an assumption. So we're just going to do a couple of examples. So the fuels example, so again, if you just turn over your to the next page, not sure if it's fuels next or electricity, but basically you want to take your vehicles data. So you want to look at, I've just put dollars spent here. Kilometers traveled is the ideal unit here, but often if you're getting like petrol receipts or mileage requests, often you'll have kilometers. If you've just got petrol receipts, say from a gas station or whatever, that's going to be in dollars, right? So why it matters is when it comes to an audit, it changes the, I guess if you want to think of an ABC outcome, there's other more technical terms that I won't kind of crowd your minds with. It changes the quality of your data and therefore the outcome you would get from an audit perspective. But again, depends how much you want to sweet this stuff. So those, because they're hybrid and electric, they're not. Yeah. That would just, so you wouldn't even necessarily, unless you have a specific ability to split them out from your main reading. Otherwise, it would just be your electricity bill. Yeah.
Excuse me, I use an electric vehicle, and last night I had a look at my power usage through my supply, and the days I charge my car, it's around about 12 kilowatt hours extra. So I'm figuring that's what I use on my trips. And I thought, what do I do with that? But I just get from an average power supply, not one that's completely green. And about 87% of New Zealand's power is hydro, which was at 13% isn't. So I'm figuring my carbon impact is 13% of 12 kilowatt hours. So in other words, about 2 kilowatt hours per day, the equivalent of that, whatever that is.
Right, that's
as far as I got.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just going to come to that in a second.
Part of our power is being carbon and carbon.
Yeah.
And even our hydro is still carbon usage in that hydro station for a number of degrees.
Did I skip one?
Oh, well,
You know,
that's
and
minimal.
the trucks that
Minimal
lines
compared with the other.
Kind of jumping ahead, but yeah, there's a emissions factor for that. So I'll come back in a sec, but that accounts for the hydro component and as a standardized unit. So I just wanted to, I think often people get quite maybe not confused, but okay, before you came in, I should have asked you this at the very beginning. Anyway, it's never too late. Did you think that measuring carbon is quite complicated, and that's possibly one of the reasons why you haven't done it yet? Yeah. So that's why I just wanted to kind of make it a bit more simplified, which it really is. It's not actually that hard. You're basically taking data in one form, converting it to another. So in the fuels example, you're dividing it by the cost of fuel per kilometre to get litres, and then you're applying your CO2 equivalent. So this is called your emissions factor. I can send you a link. There's a Ministry for Environment and Emissions Factor kind of, I was going to say Bible, so to speak. And then you pick what type of vehicle you have. So if you have a diesel vehicle, petrol vehicle, etc., you don't have to, in transport fuels, there's other emissions factors for aviation, you definitely wouldn't be using those aviation ones, like if you flew to Wellington or something. So just ignore those for now. You'll basically be drawing from pretty much probably regular petrol or diesel. So then on your sheet, what does it look like again? You're basically just going to put that emissions factor at the end. So you're going to end up with the fuel example, like the month. Maybe you have a few receipts, so you might need to total it. You could change it to week if it's easier for you. Kilometers traveled, or dollar spend. Convert that to, sorry, where am I going? Going back. So you're dividing how much you've spent per kilometer to get liters. And then you're going to apply the emissions factor, put that in the column, times it by that to get your CO2 equivalent. And that will basically tell you what your fuel, how much carbon is being used for your driving, essentially. So the other example is just electricity. It's pretty much same, but different. Oh, I don't know what's happened to that table. I'll just get rid of. Sorry, just play it for a second. So basically you're going to have your electricity data. Then you're just going to times that by the number in the table. So this has up to 2020, but that's the number you can basically use. And then you've got your CO2 equivalent for your electricity. So those are just two examples. I don't know how many of you actually brought data? Yeah. Do you want to have a go at working through a couple of those? So we'll take some time to go through those. And this is just, so just to be clear, you can get, there are multiple tools that you can use in this, and they will have preloaded emissions factors. I guess this activity shows you kind of what it's based on, where they're pulled from, but to make it a lot easier and less painful, these tools, or even like the spreadsheet that we use for our own organization, will have those emissions factors kind of already sitting there, and you just kind of have to plug your data in.
You get those from Ministry of Environment?
Yeah, so I'll do it on my phone because you saw how much technical tinkering we were doing before we started, so I'm not gonna.
So you're looking for liters of fuel because some vehicles will more than others.
And when you're wondering if, the table says like 2020, the emissions guide literally says 2022 summary. So it will mean just that the most recent number is fine. I.e., if the book's published in 2022 and the table only goes up to 2020, that'll be the latest. Does that make sense? So you were asking for this essentially, and I will send this to you. And sorry, I'm not putting it on screen. I could confound the rest of today if I do that. So basically it just has all these different emissions factors. There's 27 pages, which is quite substantial, but you basically, where's the shortcut? So travel, 14. You will, no, gone too far. So travel, this is pretty much what we have on screen. So you'll have petrol vehicle, diesel vehicle. I'll go back to this guy. So, oh no, he's got an EV. But if you have a hybrid, there's emissions factors for those as well. Yeah, so those are where your numbers come from, and
that's just called the emission factor.
Yeah. So the emissions factor is like.
So if I'm looking on the website for that, I'll just find it.
Yeah, I just googled MFE emissions factors.
Okay.
But I will send it out. Emissions factors are just, that's the normalizing whatever the gas contribution is to back to
Yeah.
CO2. So obviously with petrol and diesel, it is carbon already.
Yep.
So it's not really getting translated from anything, but if it's like, let's see if I can try and find as an example, the HVAC one. Refrigerant use, here we go, 9. Oh, do you have the fuel one? Wait. Okay, electricity's up there. Pages 7, 8. Oh, well, this is HFC and stuff. So you can just see. Hold on. I guess that's what you meant to times it by. So it's, as I said, some of them are in the tens of thousands. So some of your HVAC ones, you can see like the electricity one up there is like 0.1 or something, right? The multiplier here is you've got to times by like 10,000 for your refrigerants one.
And so what's that based on hours or?
Its unit is kg. Yeah.
So what kg of what? It's HVAC.
It'll be the kg of the, so you literally have to get, if you get it serviced each year, you'd have to get the technician person to tell you how much gas is in, like what the holding capacity is. Say it's
so
got,
it's actually how much gas is in the unit.
yeah,
This is what-
exactly.
yep.
So I mean, this is totally making up like numbers, but if it's got a holding capacity of 10 and it's down to 9, then you'd have to report on the one, like assuming it was full when you bought
Yeah.
it, that you've basically, you accept that it's somehow leaked and you're responsible for that leakage, and therefore you've
So if there's
contributed
not
back
a
to-
leak,
you're fine.
you don't report on your HVAC use?
I'm not quite sure how they do it with the audit. I think you just show some form of, like, the person's checked in, the numbers are still the same, and you would just, because a lot of this you need to provide evidence. Like you just show, they'll look through a sample of like your invoices or something, for example, so they just want to see where you're getting data from, and that they'll pick, just like accounting. Okay, 10th of June 2022, you've said you use, like, you spent $50 on fuel. They'll be like, they'll check that the invoice says that, and just do a few spot checks. And in the same sense, they'll just use this evidence for,
Yep. So
the
it's just the
HVAC thing.
usage of the gas
does that help?
involved. Yep.
But some of these tools that exist will already have emissions factors built into them. I just wanted to show you,
Yeah, no, it's good to see.
like, in a simple sense,
Yeah.
people go, jeepers, carbon accounting, that's impossible.
Yep.
But it's just saying, here's how we usually measure it. This is what you have to do to turn into something useful. And then you just apply this multiplier to it, and then you have basically your carbon equivalent.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need to be. So we have measured, we have all the things like that, but I think it's important for the wider team to understand what it's about. And how
Yeah.
Yeah. Rather than just one person. Yeah. Chris.
What's your organization, by the way?
To work at the museum. So we do all our accounting process.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I want to share with the rest of the
Yeah, cool. I'll just go around to a couple of other tables. Are you guys going okay?
Oh, not really. But I think we've got 3 months and we've got kilowatt for electricity.
Yeah.
So now we have to put on.
Oh, yes, so you didn't have to, sorry, I should have said
Oh.
either or, because some of you will have one form and some will you have the other.
Okay.
Sorry, but that's right.
That's
You've
all
got
right.
very studious. So then you just grab the emission factor from the top, which will be that 0.12. And then you've got your CO2 equivalent,
Yeah.
I can't read that.
So you.
0.12.
0.122.
Yeah.
So it'll be the same on the down. Yep.
Yeah.
Each month. Yeah.
And did you have, just checking some like vehicles ones? Whether
We
that's-
did have vehicle, but we don't have the
Could just do one
we don't
example.
have the mileage. Sorry, I've got a lot of rock gas. God, we use a lot of that. So each month, and this is all we have, so it's just diesel. No, it's all diesel actually on that one. So it's just our monthly
I guess-
accounts. I don't have that's why I thought electricity would be better.
If you convert it to, sorry, it's litres actually.
Oh, it's liters.
Yeah, I'll just check with others. So you just would need to, if you took, are you doing recently? I guess you
Yeah,
can
that's
usually do it
February,
in
for
chunks of the year,
example,
like
so that-
rather than every month, just
Ah.
maybe quarter by quarter and go roughly the fuel price, on average it was about here. If
Okay,
it's
so I've only
pretty
got 3
stable,
January, February, March. Yeah.
yeah, but you could either like kind of Google what the fuel price was in or make an assumption right now just for the sake of this activity and be like, we think the fuel price is, I don't know, $2.70 or something a litre, and then just do it on that and then go, you've got your, where's your K's? But you can go, so yeah, you spent $85, you divide it by 2.7,
Okay.
which was your assumption per litre. I just totally made that up. You
Yeah,
can pick the
yeah,
number.
yeah.
And then you apply the emissions factor and then you'd have it. So you can just do that. And sorry, I don't know how, but I mean, when you're doing so kilometers is nice to know, but if you're only going to have that if you've got people doing mileage claims. If you're
Mhm.
in general, most people are just going to have
Fuel
receipt.
cards, so
Yeah.
you do it by the litre.
Yeah, exactly.
So the dollar, month dollar.
Yeah, and then just convert to litres. So maybe just do a couple of those and then we'll regroup back.
That's right.
You guys going okay?
Yeah, we've got,
Yeah,
we,
yeah.
we love it. 12:30.
Yeah. Nearly there.
If I'm going, from, I live in Bradford, and if I'm going out to Monza, I would never.
Yeah,
go
wouldn't
out
take
to-
heaps because I didn't,
Look,
I have a few, I'll show you. Because we have to, I guess, make sure we stop with, once we've actually done what we said we would, because there's a point where you almost go into a part 2 that you could pretty much do again anyway. So
I say 15 minutes.
yeah, I've got where are they? What's going on here? Oh, we're up to here. So I just had, we won't do scope 3, but I've told people, and there were just a few things around, I think, how you reducing stuff, but I reckon you just call it and say that that's that would be, because I mean, we already have a subsequent like stuff developed on reduction, so it's probably a whole session in and of itself. I think we just say, we get to where we get to. Yeah, and we've got resources.
On environment.gpt site, we are actually filling.
Yeah, we've got resources and tools as well, which I'll just share at the end. Okay. Just one quick note about the vehicles one. I guess it depends on, so if you're doing mileage claims, I think it says on the form like kilometers and dollars, and people know the kilometers from the odometer reading. But if you're like this table here, where it had literally like gas invoices from like the BP station, say $75 on the 5th of July. If you're doing that, you just would convert dollars to litres. So you can either make this is where again from an audit perspective, they want the best quality data possible. But if you're just doing it for you and you're happy with saying, okay, we're going to pick, don't quote me on this, I'm just making this up, but on average, we think the fuel price, or you might actually look at a couple of data points, has been about $2.50 or $2.70 for most of this year. We're just going to use that as our number and document the assumption. So then you go convert to, you got your dollar figure, $75. So you divide it by 2.5 to get to the litres, and then you just times your, add your emission factor to get your thing. It's just because obviously you have, for different types of things, you have different data coming in. Similarly, you could use that for like taxis and rental cars. And there are different emissions factors for taxis and rental cars as well. So you're not just using the petrol one. So I just put these tables up as some examples. I showed these ladies. There's like a 27-page thing with all the different factors. But it's quite easy because you just navigate from the table of contents. But things are really quite broken down, so you can get a specific factor for quite a few things, including, you mentioned EV, but if you have hybrids, there's also a hybrid emission factor. So you don't have to, get too lost in your own mathematics. A lot of it's done for you. How many of you, I guess just having done that or having learned that, have found it a bit simpler than maybe you had made out in your own mind? Not accusing you of overthinking. I'm already a self-confessed overthinker.
Maybe it's me overthinking. Does the organization get accounted for the amount of travel required by your staff to reach you as a board?
Yeah, so that's the one that I was showing. So I'll just go backwards for a sec. In the Business South one, so that's under, or what scope do you think that would be under?
I would call it as part of the business.
But scope 1, 2, or 3?
Oh,
3, did you say? Yeah, definitely. And sorry, I know this has the category terminology, but this is as Business South one. This is just a list of their sources. I'm not sure. I think most of our organizations had decided to opt out because it was the first year of employee commuting and working from home, because they're not required and they can be kind of tricky to understand, especially employee commuting, unless everyone lives in the same town and travels roughly the same distance, which of course might make it easier. But yes, that is part of this. It's in scope 3, but to be clear, it's not required like as part of core emissions to consider. What I'm just going to quickly show you, and I guess it's just the prelude to, it's important to measure, and as we said, you can't manage what you don't measure. Oh, hold on, just going to show you a couple of examples. I know we're approaching time. So one of the things that we talked about was around waste. If you have time, and I realize sometimes this can take time, you might not have it, so you can maybe hope that there's enough keen beans in the group for us to have some data. You want to basically just do a mini waste audit, weigh the waste before it gets collected. Obviously, we've only got a week. Then you break it down into kg per person per day. Basically read this and I will send it to you and have a go. Or you can look at number of collections and the weight of the bins and do it that way. But that's just, given next week's focus is on minimizing waste, probably makes sense to kind of have a look at this. Although, yeah, I'll see if we have a moment at the beginning to look into this. Otherwise, you might want to attempt to do this in between times, because then if you've made a good start at your electricity and your fuel or fleet, then waste. What are the other two compulsory ones in scope 3? Open books coming back. Freight and business travel, the other two. So when I say business travel, if you're like, you just said fleet, that's confusing. That's for the other stuff like rental cars, flights, taxis, etc. So I'll send you the waste one. Just a couple of things. When it comes to measuring, hopefully you've realized it's not as hard as you thought, but especially smaller businesses, obviously everything's happening in a hurry. Records aren't always tickety-boo and perfectly kept, and that's totally understandable. You can still cram and pass your exam. I'm sure we've all had experience doing that, but it is easier if you pace yourself. So the cleaner the data, the easier the accounting. If you keep track of things, if you store them in a place, if you know the kinds of, if you've figured out what your inputs are or the things that are going to be included in carbon accounting, if you file them like physically, or if you put them in a virtual folder, keep them even in buckets of scope 1, 2, 3 or things like that. It just makes it easier for accounting. And you might find a system where you create a spreadsheet and you kind of do it as you go.
No, quick question. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
That's
Is
okay.
there a good online calculator that businesses can go in and start using, or is it still at that stage where you have to pay for the online resources to be, or the software to crunch these numbers for you.
No, there's multiple ones and free. I was just going to show you, I'm going to send you these out at the end. Just trying to see, where's the resources and tools slide, this one. I'll show you in just a second. I just wanted to, as we said at the beginning, sorry, I'll be 1 second. Lost that. 1 second. Coming. Oh. Just showing this. Sorry, it's going a bit strange. So there are, good timing, John, because we're pretty much landing here. And for those who are itching to get out the door, we are coming down the very short home straight. There's multiple tools, and I'll share any others that I can think of as well. Climate Action Toolbox is really helpful. These have all been designed as being friendly for small businesses. The reason for the activities kind of spelling out is just to show you, I guess, how this works and that it's more simple than you think. But these tools will have things like emissions factors loaded. Kogo can extract from zero. So if you use zero, it goes on a fishing expedition, and obviously it knows who BP is and it can help there. Toitu, you'll probably be aware, and that's who we use, are the New Zealand's, I guess, biggest and leading sort of carbon measurement and certification body. They have a Toitu Assess tool, which is their most simple tool for small businesses, and that's free. And yeah, you probably wouldn't ever want to read or look at the standards. But there are numerous resources in this, and I can send them out afterwards. But the main starting point is to list out all your inputs, all your sources of emissions, divide them into scopes, and then go from there. You can also, if you're kind of handy at spreadsheets and you kind of want to make your own, you literally just, one we use is just tabulated. It will say fuel, electricity, taxis, rental, like one for each, with a pasted table of the emissions factor and just columns for data. And it just shows where all the raw data is. Because if yes, you might use one of these online tools. I'm not actually sure, and I will make a note to research or check back on it. I'm not sure how they are viewed or stack up from an audit and certification perspective, like whether you can say, oh, I use this tool and it extracted my data, so it's all legit. I think there's still a place for ensuring that you have records and that someone's able to trace things and figure out that you're coming from a solid base. So in summary, we started with a very big question and bigger picture to begin with, of what kind of legacy you want to leave. And I invite you to continue to and return back there as often as you need, because it's helpful not just in a carbon perspective, but in a life perspective. We've talked about what carbon and climate change is, why it's important, what you can do about it, specifically focused on measuring emissions. And as I anticipated, like, there's a lot to cover, even doing that in 90 minutes. Probably feel very much ready to transition to another activity. The subsequent steps really are around reducing and offsetting emissions, but ultimately, as we've said, around delivering impact, and that can be in a carbon climate specific way, but it can also be much, much broader. I gave community impact as an example since earlier. So if you want to learn more about those, we can deliver something on that as a next step once you've kind of got your head around measuring emissions a little bit more. But just as another free resource that you can tap into, last year, Business New Zealand ran a all things carbon webinar series. So it literally went, you can see across the top, from measuring to verifying to reducing, offsetting emissions, and climate positive and science-based targets. And we did that with 4 different consultancies and various people from those organizations in a panel style kind of webinar format. So don't know if you are ones to geek out on that kind of stuff, but they have been done, they are there, and they're free. So you might want to listen to one of those. They're not so much just telling you in sequence, they are more panel style, but the people presenting at them really know what they're talking about. If you one of those people who've always wanted to really dive deeper into offsets, the offsetting carbon one had Sean, I guess their name's Weaver, Sean from ECOS, who has sort of spearheaded offsetting in New Zealand and the Pacific. So there's definitely some golden nuggets in that.
Where do you find this?
Very good question. You guys have great questions today. I'll send you our website following this in addition to those other resources and that blurb on the waste audit for next week. Speaking of, hopefully you already know that we have a session next Wednesday, same time. Is it same place? Yep.
Here as well. Yeah.
I'll be down next to the bins. No, I'm just kidding. He'll be in the same place. And with me, we'd love to see you back again. If you know any other fellow businesses or can think of colleagues or friends, family who actually would benefit from being here in a focused on waste minimization and regeneration, then would love to see you and them all back here next week. Thank you for hosting me, and hopefully you learned something or a lot today. Ka kite. And thanks again to Enterprise Dunedin for putting this on as well. Realized if I stand really close, like, yeah, I know you're getting the intimidation view. Raw.
Any of you have any questions over the next week, please feel free to send us an email. Lauren will be sending out content and links to everything. But again, from Business Out, thank you very much. Enterprise Navy, Louise, thank you and your team. We appreciate it and look forward to seeing you. Please, as Lauren said, share with the rest of the visitor community. I appreciate we're about to start FIFA, which is really, really exciting. At the same time, probably very daunting. It'll be a busy rest of the month, but thank you very much for coming.